Captain Sarah Chun had always been different from the other soldiers in her unit. While most people saw a petite woman with calm eyes and a quiet voice, her commanding officers saw something else entirely. They saw a warrior who had survived 3 tours of duty in some of the world's most dangerous regions, a tactical genius who could read battlefields like most people read books, and a soldier who never left anyone behind. The morning of March 15th started like any other day at Forward Operating Base Mustang in the mountainous region of eastern Afghanistan. Sarah was reviewing intelligence reports in the command tent when Lieutenant Rodriguez burst through the canvas flap, his face pale with urgency. "Captain Chun, we have a situation," Rodriguez said, slightly out of breath from running across the base. "Alpha Company is pinned down in the Coast Valley." They were conducting a routine patrol when they walked into what appears to be a coordinated ambush. We're talking about at least 50 enemy fighters with heavy weapons. Sarah looked up from the maps spread across the metal table. Her mind immediately began processing the tactical situation. The Coast Valley was a narrow corridor between 2 steep mountain ridges, perfect terrain for an ambush. If Alpha Company was trapped there, they would have limited escape routes and minimal cover. "How many of our people are we talking about?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her gear. 18 soldiers, ma'am. They're dug in behind some rocks near the valley floor, but the enemy has them surrounded on 3 sides. They have the high ground and better positions. Our guys are running low on ammunition, and we have at least 4 wounded. Sarah studied the topographical map of the area. The valley was approximately 12 kilometers from their current position, too far for ground vehicles to reach quickly enough. The terrain was too rough for armored vehicles, and the narrow valley would make any ground approach extremely dangerous. The enemy had chosen their ambush site well. "What about air support?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. 2 Apache helicopters are en route, but they're still 40 minutes out. Fixed-wing aircraft can't get close enough because of the mountain peaks and the risk of hitting our own people. The enemy is too close to Alpha Company's position. Sarah nodded grimly. 40 minutes was an eternity in a firefight. Good soldiers could die in 40 seconds, let alone 40 minutes. She had seen too many situations where delays meant body bags instead of successful rescues. "What's the extraction plan?" she asked. Rodriguez hesitated. "Command is still working on it, ma'am. The terrain makes helicopter landing impossible in the valley. They're looking at possible landing zones on the ridgelines, but even those are at least a kilometer away from Alpha Company's position." Sarah studied the map more carefully. The valley was shaped like a funnel, with steep walls on both sides rising nearly vertical for several hundred feet. The enemy had positioned themselves on the eastern ridge, giving them clear fields of fire down into the valley. Alpha Company was trapped at the narrow end of the funnel, like fish in a barrel. "Who's in command of Alpha Company?" Sarah asked. "Captain Martinez, ma'am. Good officer, solid tactical sense. He's the one who managed to get his people into cover when the shooting started. But his radio operator was one of the first casualties, so communication is sporadic." Sarah had served with Martinez during her second deployment. He was indeed a good officer, the kind who would fight to the last bullet to protect his soldiers. That quality made him an excellent leader, but it also meant he might not retreat, even when retreat was the smart tactical choice. The sound of rotors grew louder outside the tent. Sarah could hear the distinctive whop 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 of a Black Hawk helicopter approaching the landing pad. She grabbed her rifle and combat gear, her mind already formulating a plan that her commanding officers would probably consider insane. "Rodriguez, get on the radio to whoever's flying that bird. I need to know their fuel status, ammunition load, and crew composition. Also, find out if they have fast rope capability." "Fast rope? Ma'am?" In that terrain, Sarah was already strapping on her body armor. "The enemy expects us to come from the ground or wait for heavy air support. They won't expect a single soldier to drop right into the middle of their positions." Rodriguez stared at her. "Captain, with respect, that's suicide. You'd be one person against 50 enemy fighters. Not if I do it right." Sarah checked her weapons systematically. Her M4 rifle was clean, and loaded. Her sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226, was secured in its holster. She had 8 magazines for the rifle and 3 for the pistol. It wasn't much for a prolonged firefight, but it would have to do. "Ma'am, I really think you should wait for backup. Those Apaches will be here soon, and we could coordinate a proper assault." Sarah looked at Rodriguez with the expression that had earned her respect from soldiers throughout her career. It wasn't harsh or angry, but it carried absolute authority. "In 40 minutes, some of those 18 soldiers will be dead. Maybe all of them. I've seen what happens when good people wait for perfect conditions that never come." She finished checking her gear and headed toward the tent exit. "Give me everything you can on the enemy positions. Radio frequencies they're using, estimated weapons, anything our surveillance drones picked up. I'll be at the helicopter." The walk to the landing pad took less than 2 minutes, but Sarah used every second to refine her mental picture of the tactical situation. The enemy had chosen their position well, but that also meant they were predictable. They would have machine gun nests on the high ground, probably mortars for indirect fire, and riflemen spread along the ridge to prevent flanking movements. The Black Hawk helicopter sat on the metal landing pad, its rotors spinning lazily as the crew performed final checks. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Johnson, was a veteran aviator with over 15 years of flight experience. Sarah had flown with him twice before and trusted his skills completely. "Johnson, I need you to get me to grid coordinates 345.678 as fast as this machine will fly," Sarah shouted over the rotor noise as she approached the aircraft. The pilot looked up from his instrument panel, surprised to see her. "Captain Chun, I thought this was a supply run to FOB Delta." "Change of plans. We have 18 soldiers trapped in an ambush situation. I need insertion directly into the combat zone." Johnson studied her face for a moment. He had been flying combat missions long enough to recognize the look of an officer who had made a decision and wouldn't be talked out of it. "Ma'am, insertion into a hot landing zone without support is against standard operating procedures. I need authorization from battalion command." Sarah climbed into the helicopter and began connecting her communications headset. "Johnson, those soldiers don't have time for proper authorization. Every minute we wait increases the chance that good people die today." The pilot hesitated. He knew the regulations, but he also knew Captain Chen's reputation. She wasn't the kind of officer who made reckless decisions. If she said soldiers were in immediate danger, they were in immediate danger. "What kind of insertion are we talking about, ma'am?" "Fast rope into the valley, approximately 200 meters from the enemy positions. I'll need you to come in low and fast, drop me off, and get clear before they can target the aircraft effectively." Johnson's co-pilot, Lieutenant Williams, turned around in his seat. "Captain, that's extremely dangerous for all of us. If we get shot down, the situation becomes much worse." Sarah appreciated their concern, but she had already calculated the risks. The longer Alpha Company stays pinned down, the more organized the enemy becomes. Right now, they're focused on maintaining their ambush. If I can disrupt their positions from behind, it gives our people a chance to break contact and withdraw. She pulled out the map and showed the crew her intended landing zone. "Bring me in from the west, following this ridge line. The terrain will mask our approach until the last minute. I'll rope down here behind this rock formation. That puts me approximately 50 meters from their rear positions." Johnson studied the map and the terrain features Sarah was indicating. It was tactically sound, but incredibly risky. The margin for error was essentially zero. If the helicopter took fire during insertion, they could all be killed. If Sarah's calculations about enemy positions were wrong, she would rope down directly into enemy fire. "Ma'am, even if we get you on the ground safely, you'll be outnumbered 50-1. How do you plan to survive long enough to make a difference?" Sarah secured her rifle and checked her radio one final time. "I'm not planning to fight 50 people at once. I'm planning to make them think they're being attacked by a much larger force from an unexpected direction. Confusion and misdirection can be just as effective as overwhelming firepower." The helicopter's engines were warming up, and Sarah could see Rodriguez running across the tarmac with a folder of intelligence reports. She signaled him to approach the aircraft. "Here's everything we have on enemy positions and radio traffic," Rodriguez shouted as he handed her the folder. "Captain, please reconsider this. Wait for proper support." Sarah quickly scanned the intelligence reports. The enemy was indeed well-positioned and well-equipped. They had at least 2 machine gun positions, probable mortar teams, and an estimated 40 to 50 riflemen. But the reports also confirmed what she had suspected. They were focused entirely on the trapped soldiers below and hadn't established rear security. "Rodriguez, get on the radio to Captain Martinez if possible. Tell him to watch for disruption in enemy positions from the East Ridge in approximately 20 minutes. When that happens, he should be ready to move his people toward the southern exit of the valley." "Yes, ma'am. And if something happens to you?" Sarah looked at him with a slight smile. "Then, make sure the after-action report mentions that I was following standard tactical doctrine for immediate action when friendly forces are in contact." She turned to Johnson. "Let's go. Time is running out for those soldiers." The pilot made his final decision and increased power to the rotors. "Strap in, Captain. This is going to be a rough ride." As the Black Hawk lifted off from FOB Mustang, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before combat operations. She had made similar decisions dozens of times during her career, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, the risks greater, and the margin for error smaller than anything she had attempted before. Through her headset, she could hear the radio chatter from Alpha Company's position. Sporadic gunfire, calls for ammunition, updates on wounded soldiers. The voices were calm, but tense, the sound of professional soldiers doing their job under impossible circumstances. "Mustang Base, this is Alpha 6, came Captain Martinez's voice through the static. "We are still in contact with enemy forces. Ammunition running low. Request immediate extraction or reinforcement." "Alpha 6, this is Mustang Base. Support is en route. Hold your position and prepare for relief from unexpected direction." Sarah smiled grimly. Martinez would understand that cryptic message. He was smart enough to know that conventional relief wasn't possible in their current situation. He would be watching for whatever unconventional solution was coming his way. The helicopter flew low and fast across the mountainous terrain, following ridge lines and valleys to avoid detection. Johnson was an excellent pilot, keeping the aircraft below radar coverage while maintaining maximum speed toward the target area. 5 minutes out, Captain." Johnson's voice crackled through her headset. "I can see smoke from the contact area. Looks like active fighting." Sarah looked out the window at the terrain below. The mountains were harsh and unforgiving, perfect for the kind of guerrilla warfare that had characterized this conflict for years. She could see why the enemy had chosen this location for their ambush. It was a natural killing field. "Remember, once I'm on the rope, get clear immediately. Don't wait to see if I make it to the ground safely. The longer you stay in the area, the greater the risk of taking fire." "Understood, ma'am. Good luck down there." Sarah moved to the cabin door and prepared the fast rope equipment. The thick rope was already secured to the helicopter's frame, ready for deployment. She double-checked her gear one final time, ensuring everything was secure for the descent. 2 minutes out, Johnson announced, "I can see muzzle flashes from the enemy positions. They're exactly where the intelligence reports indicated." Through the aircraft window, Sarah could see the narrow valley spread out below. Smoke and dust marked the location where Alpha Company was pinned down. Higher up on the eastern ridge, she could see the telltale signs of enemy positions, sandbags, camouflaged fighting positions, and the occasional muzzle flash. 30 seconds, Captain. Are you ready?" Sarah positioned herself at the cabin door, her hands gripping the rope. Below, the ground rushed past at frightening speed. In a few moments, she would be alone in enemy territory, outnumbered and surrounded, with only her training and experience to keep her alive. "Ready," she replied, though she wondered if anyone could ever really be ready for what she was about to do. The helicopter slowed and began its approach to the insertion point. Sarah could hear the change in engine pitch as Johnson prepared for the critical moment when she would slide down the rope into what might be the last battle of her military career. The rope dropped from the hovering Black Hawk like a lifeline into hell. Sarah wrapped her gloved hands around the thick nylon cord and stepped into empty air, beginning her descent into what intelligence reports described as a coordinated enemy stronghold. The wind from the rotor wash whipped around her as she slid down toward the rocky outcropping that would serve as her landing zone. 40 feet below, the ground rushed up to meet her. Sarah could hear the distant chatter of automatic weapons fire echoing through the valley, punctuated by the occasional boom of mortar rounds. The sound of combat was both familiar and terrifying, a deadly symphony she had heard too many times during her military career. Her boots hit the rocky ground with a jarring impact that sent vibrations through her legs. Sarah immediately released the rope and rolled behind a large boulder, pressing herself against the cold stone as the helicopter banked away sharply. The pilot was following her instructions perfectly, getting clear of the area before enemy fighters could target the aircraft. For a moment, the mountain ridge was quiet except for the fading sound of rotor blades. Sarah used those precious seconds to orient herself and assess her immediate surroundings. The intelligence reports had been accurate. She was positioned on the eastern ridge, approximately 50 meters behind the main enemy defensive line, exactly where she had planned to be. Through gaps in the rock formation, she could see the backs of several enemy fighters. They were focused entirely on the valley below, maintaining steady fire on the trapped American soldiers. Their positions were well constructed, with sandbags and natural rock formations providing excellent cover from return fire. No wonder Alpha Company was having such difficulty breaking out of the ambush. Sarah counted at least 12 fighters visible from her current position, and she knew there were many more spread along the ridgeline. Each man was armed with either an AK-47 assault rifle or a PKM machine gun. Several had rocket-propelled grenades propped against nearby rocks, ready for use against any armored vehicles that might attempt a rescue. The nearest enemy position was a machine gun nest built into a natural depression between two large boulders. 2 men operated the weapon, while a third fed ammunition belts into the gun. They were maintaining steady, disciplined fire into the valley, clearly experienced fighters who knew their business. Sarah checked her watch. She had been on the ground for less than 2 minutes, but already she could hear changes in the pattern of gunfire from the valley below. Alpha Company was running low on ammunition, just as Rodriguez had reported. Their return fire was becoming sporadic and less effective. Time was running out fast. Moving carefully to avoid dislodging loose rocks, Sarah crept closer to the machine gun position. Her approach route took her through a maze of boulders and stunted pine trees that provided excellent concealment. The enemy fighters had positioned themselves to dominate the valley below, but they had not established proper security to their rear. It was exactly the kind of tactical oversight that professional soldiers learn not to make, but these fighters were focused entirely on their primary target. 20 meters from the machine gun nest, Sarah could hear the enemy fighters talking in low voices. Her limited knowledge of the local language told her they were discussing ammunition supplies and target priorities. One man pointed toward different positions in the valley below, apparently directing fire onto specific American positions. Sarah settled into a firing position behind a fallen tree trunk, her rifle aimed at the machine gun crew. Her plan was simple but dangerous. She would eliminate the machine gun position with rapid, accurate fire, then immediately move to her next target before the enemy could react effectively. Speed and surprise were her only advantages against such overwhelming numbers. She controlled her breathing and lined up her first shot. The machine gunner was clearly visible in her scope, his head and shoulders exposed above the sandbags. Sarah had made similar shots hundreds of times during training and combat operations. At this range, with a stable firing position and clear visibility, it should be routine. But Sarah also knew that once she fired her first shot, everything would change. The element of surprise would be gone, and 48 enemy fighters would be looking for her. She would have perhaps 30 seconds before they located her position and began returning fire. Those 30 seconds had to count. Sarah squeezed the trigger slowly and steadily, exactly as she had been trained. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder with familiar authority, and the machine gunner dropped without a sound. She immediately shifted her aim to the ammunition bearer and fired again. The second man fell backward against the rocks, his hands clutching his chest. The third member of the machine gun crew looked around in confusion, unable to understand where the shots had come from. Sarah's third bullet took him center mass, and he collapsed across the silent machine gun. The entire engagement had taken less than 5 seconds, but Sarah was already moving to her next position. She could hear shouts from other enemy positions as fighters tried to understand what had happened to the machine gun crew. Some were calling for medical assistance. Others were demanding to know if anyone had seen muzzle flashes. Sarah moved quickly through the rocks toward a cluster of riflemen positioned 30 meters to the south. These fighters were still focused on the valley below, but she could see some of them beginning to look around nervously. The sudden silence from the machine gun position was making them realize something was wrong. As she moved, Sarah could hear the radio chatter from Alpha Company's position changing. Captain Martinez's voice came through her earpiece, tense but hopeful. Mustang Base, enemy fire from the eastern ridge has decreased significantly. Unknown cause. We're preparing to move wounded personnel toward extraction point. That was exactly what Sarah had hoped to hear. The elimination of the machine gun position was already having an impact on the tactical situation. Alpha Company was getting breathing room to reorganize and begin their withdrawal. But Sarah knew her success would be temporary unless she could maintain pressure on the enemy positions. The fighters would quickly adapt to the new threat and begin hunting for her. She needed to eliminate as many weapons positions as possible before they could coordinate an effective response. The group of riflemen ahead of her consisted of 5 men spread across a natural firing line between rock outcroppings. They had good positions with overlapping fields of fire into the valley, but like the machine gun crew, they had not established security to their rear. Sarah could approach to within 15 meters without being detected. She selected a new firing position behind a large granite boulder that provided both cover and concealment. From here, she had clear shots at 3 of the 5 riflemen, while the other 2 were partially hidden behind rocks. Sarah would have to eliminate the visible targets quickly, then reposition before the survivors could return fire effectively. The first rifleman was kneeling behind a sandbag wall, his AK-47 pointed down into the valley. Sarah's bullet caught him in the head, and he toppled forward without a sound. The second man was standing partially exposed beside a pine tree. Sarah's second shot dropped him where he stood. The third target was more challenging. He was lying prone behind a low rock wall, with only his head and rifle visible. Sarah aimed carefully and fired. The bullet struck the rock inches from the man's head, sending stone fragments flying. The fighter rolled away from his position, shouting warnings to his companions. Sarah cursed under her breath. She had missed a relatively easy shot, probably due to adrenaline affecting her fine motor control. Now the remaining fighters knew approximately where she was located, and they were beginning to return fire. Bullets began striking the rocks around her position as the surviving enemy fighters tried to suppress her fire. Sarah could hear more voices shouting along the ridge line as other fighters began moving toward her location. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. She fired 2 quick shots at the exposed riflemen, forcing them to keep their heads down, then began moving to a new position. Staying in one place too long would be fatal once the enemy fighters organized a proper response. As she moved through the rocks, Sarah could hear the enemy fighters calling to each other in their local language. Some were trying to coordinate flanking movements, while others were calling for support from positions further along the ridge. They were reacting professionally to her attack, which meant she was dealing with experienced fighters rather than untrained militia. Sarah found a new firing position behind a cluster of boulders that gave her a different angle on the enemy positions. From here, she could see several fighters moving through the rocks, trying to locate her previous position. They were being careful, using proper tactical movement techniques, but they were also predictable. She selected the most exposed fighter and fired carefully. The man dropped immediately, his rifle clattering against the rocks. His companions immediately took cover, but Sarah had already identified her next target. Another careful shot eliminated a second fighter who had exposed too much of his body while seeking cover. The ridge line erupted in automatic weapons fire as the enemy fighters began shooting at anything that might conceal an attacker. Bullets ricocheted off rocks and whined through the air around Sarah's position. She pressed herself against the ground and waited for the initial burst of panic fire to subside. Through her earpiece, she could hear Alpha Company beginning their withdrawal. Captain Martinez was calling out tactical movement orders as his soldiers prepared to break contact with the enemy. The plan was working, but Sarah knew she had to maintain pressure on the enemy positions to give Alpha Company time to reach safety. When the wild firing died down, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. One of the enemy fighters was speaking into a radio, apparently calling for reinforcements. If additional enemy fighters arrived in the area, both she and Alpha Company would be in serious trouble. She had to act fast to prevent the enemy from regaining the initiative. Sarah identified the fighter with the radio, a man positioned behind sandbags approximately 40 meters away. It was a long shot under combat conditions, but she had to take it. Sarah controlled her breathing and lined up the shot carefully. The radio operator was partially concealed, with only his head and shoulders visible above the sandbags. She squeezed the trigger slowly, and the fighter spun around and fell backward, his radio flying from his hands. Immediately, Sarah began moving again. The enemy fighters were getting closer to her position, and staying static would be suicide. She needed to find a new vantage point that would allow her to continue disrupting enemy operations while avoiding being surrounded. As she moved through the maze of rocks and vegetation, Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. The Apache gunships were finally arriving, which meant heavy air support would soon be available. But she also knew that her own position was becoming increasingly precarious as more enemy fighters converged on her area. Sarah found a defensive position in a natural rock shelter that provided protection on 3 sides, while giving her a clear view of the main enemy positions. From here, she could see the chaos her attack had created among the enemy fighters. Some were still trying to locate her position, others were attempting to maintain fire on Alpha Company, and several were clearly confused about what was happening. She could also see Alpha Company beginning their tactical withdrawal from the valley floor. Captain Martinez had his soldiers moving in small groups, using proper bounding techniques to maintain security while moving toward the extraction point. Several wounded soldiers were being carried by their teammates, slowing the movement but maintaining unit integrity. Sarah knew she had to buy Alpha Company more time, but her ammunition was running low. She had started with 8 magazines for her rifle and had already used 5 of them. At her current rate of fire, she had perhaps 10 more minutes of sustained combat before she would be reduced to her sidearm. The sound of helicopter rotors was getting louder, and Sarah could see 2 Apache gunships approaching the valley from the west. The cavalry was arriving, but she still had work to do. The enemy fighters were beginning to reorganize, and some were setting up new positions to interdict Alpha Company's withdrawal route. Sarah identified a group of fighters who were moving to establish a blocking position along Alpha Company's escape route. If they succeeded in setting up that position, they could inflict serious casualties on the withdrawing Americans. She had to stop them before they could get into position. Taking careful aim at the lead fighter, Sarah fired her next shot. The man stumbled and fell, causing his companions to scatter for cover. She quickly engaged 2 more fighters, forcing the entire group to abandon their movement and seek defensive positions. But As she fired, Sarah heard the distinctive crack of a bullet passing close to her head. One of the enemy fighters had finally gotten a good angle on her position and was returning accurate fire. Rock fragments exploded near her face as more bullets struck her cover. Sarah realized her position was compromised. She had to move immediately or risk being overwhelmed by converging enemy forces. Grabbing her rifle, she began a tactical withdrawal toward a new position, using fire and movement techniques to avoid being pinned down. As she moved, the Apache gunships opened fire on the main enemy positions along the ridgeline. The sound of 30mm cannon fire echoed through the valley as the helicopter crews engaged targets that posed the greatest threat to Alpha Company. Sarah could see enemy fighters running for deeper cover as the devastating air support began to turn the tide of battle. But Sarah's immediate problem was the group of fighters who had located her position and were now pursuing her through the rocks. She could hear them calling to each other as they tried to coordinate their hunt. They knew approximately where she was, and they were closing in with professional skill and determination. Sarah could hear them getting closer. The enemy fighters were conducting a methodical search through the rock formations, checking every possible hiding place as they advanced toward her last known position. Their voices carried clearly in the thin mountain air, coordinating their movements with the precision of experienced soldiers. She pressed herself against the cold granite wall of a narrow crevice between two massive boulders, controlling her breathing to minimize any sound. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see 3 fighters moving carefully through the terrain about 20 meters away. They were armed with AK-47 rifles and moved with the controlled aggression of men who knew how to hunt human prey. The lead fighter held up his hand, stopping his companions. Sarah watched as he knelt beside a disturbed area of ground where her boots had left faint impressions in the sandy soil between rocks. The man examined the tracks carefully, then pointed in her general direction and whispered something to his companions. Sarah realized they had found her trail. These weren't amateur militia fighters stumbling around the mountains. They were skilled trackers who understood how to read sign and follow a quarry through difficult terrain. Her advantage of surprise was gone, and now she was being hunted by professionals. The 3 fighters spread out in a classic search formation, with one man moving directly toward her position while the other 2 flanked to either side. Sarah calculated distances and angles, trying to determine if she could eliminate all 3 before one of them could return fire or call for help. Her rifle had 2 rounds remaining in the current magazine, plus 1 full magazine in her gear. That gave her enough ammunition for a short engagement, but she had to make every shot count. Miss even once, and the surviving fighters would pin her down until reinforcements arrived. The lead tracker was now 15 meters away and moving directly toward her hiding place. Sarah could see his eyes scanning the rocks methodically, looking for any sign of movement or unnatural shapes. In perhaps 30 seconds, he would be close enough to spot her position. Sarah made her decision. Waiting for the perfect shot was a luxury she couldn't afford. She needed to act while she still had some element of surprise. Rising from her concealment, she fired twice in rapid succession at the lead fighter, then immediately shifted her aim toward the man flanking to her left. The first fighter dropped where he stood, but her second shot missed the flanking fighter by inches, striking the rock beside his head. The man dove for cover behind a fallen tree trunk, shouting warnings to his companion. Sarah's third shot caught the fighter on her right before he could reach cover, but now her magazine was empty and she had 1 enemy still in the fight. Ejecting the empty magazine, Sarah slammed her last full magazine into the rifle as bullets began striking around her position. The surviving fighter was firing rapidly from behind his cover, tried to keep her pinned down while he maneuvered for a better shooting angle. Sarah could hear more voices calling from positions further away along the ridgeline. Other enemy fighters were responding to the sound of gunfire, and they would be converging on her location within minutes. She had to eliminate the remaining threat quickly and find a new position before she was surrounded. The enemy fighter was approximately 20 meters away, partially concealed behind the fallen tree. Sarah could see portions of his body as he moved behind the cover, trying to get an angle for an effective shot. She waited patiently for him to expose enough of himself for a clean shot. When the fighter rose slightly to aim his rifle, Sarah was ready. Her bullet caught him center mass, and he fell backward without firing. The ridge was suddenly quiet except for the distant sound of the Apache helicopters engaging targets elsewhere along the enemy line. But Sarah knew the quiet wouldn't last. She could hear multiple voices calling from different positions as enemy fighters tried to coordinate their search for the American soldier who was disrupting their operations. Some voices were close, perhaps 50 meters away. Others were more distant, but she could tell they were moving in her direction. Sarah began moving immediately, heading north along the ridge toward a series of rock formations that offered better defensive positions. As she moved, she could hear radio chatter from Alpha Company's withdrawal operation. Captain Martinez was reporting steady progress toward the extraction point, with helicopter support keeping enemy fire suppressed. That was good news, but Sarah's own situation was becoming increasingly desperate. She was down to her last magazine of rifle ammunition, and there were still dozens of enemy fighters in the area. The Apache helicopters were devastating the main enemy positions, but they couldn't provide close support for her without risking friendly fire in the confused tactical situation. As she moved through the rocks, Sarah heard something that made her freeze in place. One of the enemy fighters was speaking English with a clear accent, apparently communicating with foreign advisors or commanders. The conversation was brief, but she caught enough to understand that reinforcements were being called from positions elsewhere in the valley. Sarah realized the tactical situation was about to become much worse. Fresh enemy fighters would arrive soon, and they would be specifically briefed about the American soldier operating behind their lines. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. She found a defensive position in a cluster of boulders that provided good cover and excellent observation of the surrounding terrain. From here, she could see several enemy fighters moving carefully through the rocks, searching for her trail. They were being more cautious now, having learned that their quarry was dangerous and accurate with a rifle. Through her earpiece, Sarah heard welcome news from the Apache crews. The helicopter gunships had identified and engaged several enemy positions that were threatening Alpha Company's withdrawal route. The devastating firepower of the attack helicopters was finally beginning to tip the tactical balance. But Sarah also heard disturbing information in the radio traffic. One of the Apache pilots reported seeing additional enemy fighters moving toward the eastern ridge from positions deeper in the mountains. The reinforcements were arriving earlier than expected, and there were more of them than intelligence had estimated. Sarah counted at least 8 enemy fighters visible from her current position, all moving through the rocks with professional skill. They were conducting a coordinated search, checking each potential hiding place systematically while maintaining security against ambush. In perhaps 5 minutes, they would reach her position. She needed a way to break contact and escape the closing net, but the terrain offered limited options. Behind her was open ground that provided no cover. To either side were steep cliff faces that were impossible to climb quickly. Her only option was to continue moving north along the ridge, staying ahead of the search teams while looking for an opportunity to break contact completely. Sarah began moving carefully through the rock formations, using every available bit of cover and concealment to mask her movement. She could hear the enemy fighters calling to each other as they coordinated their search pattern, their voices getting closer with each passing minute. As she moved, Sarah came across something unexpected. Hidden among the rocks was an enemy ammunition cache, probably positioned to resupply the fighters during extended operations. The cache contained several cases of rifle ammunition, hand grenades, and rocket-propelled grenade rounds. Sarah realized this discovery gave her a new tactical option. Instead of simply evading the enemy search teams, she could use their own munitions against them. The ammunition cache was positioned near the center of their search area, making it an ideal location for a devastating surprise attack. Working quickly, Sarah rigged several hand grenades with shortened fuses and positioned them around the ammunition cache. When the enemy fighters approached the area, the resulting explosion would eliminate multiple targets while creating confusion and panic among the survivors. But as Sarah prepared her improvised ambush, she heard the sound that confirmed her worst fears. The distinctive chatter of additional automatic weapons was coming from the southern end of the ridge, where the reinforcements were arriving. She could hear vehicle engines in the distance, indicating that the enemy was bringing heavier weapons and more sophisticated equipment to the fight. Sarah finished preparing her ambush and moved to an observation position where she could watch the ammunition cache while remaining concealed. Through gaps in the rocks, she could see the enemy search teams continuing their systematic advance through the area. The lead team was now approximately 30 meters from the cache location, moving slowly but steadily toward the trap she had prepared. Sarah checked her watch and calculated timing. The explosion would occur when the maximum number of targets were in the kill zone, but she would have to time it perfectly to achieve maximum effect. Through her earpiece, she heard Captain Martinez reporting that Alpha Company was approaching the extraction point. The wounded soldiers were being prepared for helicopter evacuation, and the unit was establishing security for the landing zone. The mission was succeeding, but Sarah was still trapped behind enemy lines with limited ammunition and increasing enemy pressure. The first enemy fighter reached the area around the ammunition cache, looking carefully among the rocks for signs of the American soldier. Sarah watched as more fighters converged on the location, drawn by their systematic search pattern directly into her killing zone. When 6 fighters were positioned around the cache, Sarah triggered the improvised explosive device by firing a single shot at one of the prepared grenades. The resulting explosion was tremendous, echoing across the valley like thunder. Rocks and equipment flew in all directions as the secondary explosions from the stored ammunition created a devastating blast. The explosion eliminated all 6 fighters instantly and sent shock waves through the remaining enemy forces. Sarah could hear screaming and shouting from positions across the ridge as fighters tried to understand what had happened. The coordinated search operation collapsed into confusion and panic. Sarah used the chaos to begin moving toward her final extraction point. The Apache helicopters were now engaging targets throughout the area, and she could hear additional aircraft approaching from the direction of FOB Mustang. Heavy reinforcements were finally arriving, but she still had to survive long enough to benefit from them. As she moved through the smoke and debris from the explosion, Sarah encountered 2 enemy fighters who had survived the blast, but were disoriented and wounded. Both men were staggering through the rocks, bleeding from shrapnel wounds and temporarily blinded by the explosion. Sarah eliminated both fighters quickly with her sidearm, conserving her remaining rifle ammunition for more distant targets. The Sig Sauer was reliable and accurate at close range, and these targets presented no significant tactical challenge. But as she moved past the wounded fighters, Sarah heard something that changed everything. One of the enemy radios was crackling with traffic in English, and she could clearly understand the conversation. Foreign military advisors were coordinating a major counterattack designed to eliminate the American soldier operating behind their lines. The conversation revealed that reinforcements included not just local fighters, but foreign military personnel with sophisticated equipment and training. They were bringing night vision devices, thermal imaging systems, and coordinated air defense weapons to the engagement. Sarah realized that her mission had evolved far beyond the original rescue operation. She had stumbled into a much larger enemy operation that involved foreign military involvement in the local conflict. This intelligence was potentially more valuable than the tactical success of rescuing Alpha Company. She activated her emergency beacon to transmit her location to friendly forces, then began moving toward a position where she could observe and report on the arriving enemy reinforcements. The information she could gather might be crucial for future operations in the region. As Sarah moved through the rocks toward her new observation position, she could hear the sound of vehicles approaching along mountain roads that intelligence reports had indicated were impassable. The enemy had capabilities and resources that exceeded previous estimates, and someone needed to document those capabilities for future reference. The battle was far from over, and Sarah Chun was about to discover that jumping from a helicopter into an enemy ambush had been only the beginning of her longest day in combat. The sound of diesel engines grew louder as Sarah reached her new observation position among a cluster of wind-carved rocks that provided both concealment and a clear view of the valley below. Through gaps in the stone formations, she could see a convoy of vehicles climbing the narrow mountain road that intelligence reports had dismissed as impassable for military operations. 3 modified pickup trucks led the convoy, each mounted with heavy machine guns and carrying 8 to 10 fighters. Behind them came 2 larger vehicles that looked like armored personnel carriers, though Sarah couldn't identify the exact type from her current distance. The convoy also included what appeared to be a mobile command vehicle with multiple radio antennas and sophisticated electronic equipment. Sarah activated her tactical radio and began transmitting intelligence reports to FOB Mustang, providing detailed descriptions of the enemy vehicles and equipment. This information would be crucial for understanding the true scope of enemy capabilities in the region. The intelligence reports had seriously underestimated both enemy strength and their access to advanced military equipment. Mustang Base, this is Raven 6, Sarah whispered into her radio microphone. I have eyes on enemy reinforcements approaching grid coordinates 345.689. Count 12 vehicles, including armored personnel carriers and mobile command units. Estimate 40 to 50 additional personnel with heavy weapons. The response came immediately through her earpiece. Raven 6, this is Mustang Base. Confirm your current position and status. Alpha Company has reached extraction point and is preparing for evacuation. Mustang Base, I am approximately 800 meters northeast of Alpha Company's position, observing enemy reinforcements from concealed position. I have limited ammunition remaining, but am not in immediate contact with enemy forces. Sarah paused as she observed something concerning through her rifle scope. Several of the fighters dismounting from the vehicles were wearing different uniforms than the local fighters she had been engaging. These men had modern military equipment, including advanced communication gear and what appear to be night vision devices despite the daylight conditions. Mustang Base, be advised that enemy reinforcements include foreign military personnel with advanced equipment. This is not just local militia. Someone has provided professional military advisors and sophisticated gear. The radio was quiet for several seconds before the response came. Raven 6, that intelligence is extremely important. Continue observation and reporting. Air support is being redirected to your area. Sarah watched as the convoy reached the top of the ridge and began deploying personnel in organized formations. The foreign advisors were clearly directing the operation, pointing toward different terrain features and issuing orders through hand signals and radio communications. This was a professional military operation, not the improvised response she had expected from local fighters. One of the armored personnel carriers was equipped with a large caliber weapon that Sarah recognized as an anti-aircraft gun. The crew was setting up the weapon in a position that would threaten any aircraft attempting to provide close air support. The Apache helicopters that had been dominating the engagement would be vulnerable to this kind of weapon system. Sarah transmitted this critical information immediately. Mustang Base, enemy is deploying anti-aircraft weapons that will threaten helicopter operations. Recommend immediate engagement before weapon system becomes operational. As she watched, teams of fighters began spreading across the ridge in what was clearly a coordinated search operation. Unlike the earlier pursuit, this effort was being directed by someone with professional military training. The search teams moved with precision and discipline establishing security while advancing systematically through the terrain. Sarah realized her position would be discovered within minutes unless she acted immediately. The professional search techniques being employed would locate her hiding place much more quickly than the earlier pursuit attempts. She needed to disrupt their operation before they could organize effectively. Looking at the enemy deployment through her rifle scope, Sarah identified the most critical targets. The foreign advisors directing the operation were positioned near the mobile command vehicle, apparently coordinating the search operation through radio communications. Eliminating those key personnel would disrupt enemy command and control. The range to the command vehicle was approximately 300 meters, at the extreme limit of effective accuracy for her rifle under combat conditions. Sarah would have one chance to eliminate the key targets before the enemy located her position and returned overwhelming fire. Sarah settled into a stable shooting position behind a large rock that provided both support for her rifle and protection from return fire. She studied the targets through her scope, identifying the most important personnel based on their equipment and apparent authority over other fighters. The primary target was a man wearing a different uniform who was pointing toward different areas of the ridge while speaking into a radio handset. Two other foreign personnel were positioned nearby, apparently receiving instructions and relaying orders to the search teams. Eliminating all three would significantly disrupt enemy operations. Sarah controlled her breathing and lined up her first shot carefully. The range was long, and wind conditions on a mountain ridge would affect bullet trajectory, but she had made similar shots during her military career. The key was patience and precise execution. Her first shot struck the primary target's center mass, dropping him beside the command vehicle. Sarah immediately shifted her aim to the second target, a man who was turning toward his fallen companion with confusion evident in his movements. Her second shot eliminated him before he could react effectively to the attack. The third target was already moving toward cover when Sarah fired her final shot at the group. The bullet struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around but not eliminating him completely. Sarah had hit 2 out of 3 targets, which would have to be sufficient given her limited ammunition. The ridge erupted in automatic weapons fire as enemy fighters tried to identify Sarah's position. Bullets struck the rocks around her hiding place, sending stone fragments flying in all directions. Sarah pressed herself against the ground and waited for the initial burst of panic fire to subside. Through her earpiece, she could hear radio traffic indicating that Alpha Company's evacuation was proceeding successfully. The wounded soldiers were being loaded onto medical helicopters while the remaining personnel prepared for extraction. Captain Martinez was coordinating the final phases of the withdrawal operation. But Sarah's situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The enemy forces were now organized under professional leadership, despite her successful elimination of key personnel. The search operation was continuing with multiple teams converging on her approximate location. Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions. The radio traffic indicated that additional air support was arriving, including both Apache gunships and fast-moving jet aircraft. The massive firepower advantage would soon shift to friendly forces, but Sarah had to survive the next few minutes before that support could be effective. Looking through gaps in the rocks, Sarah could see enemy fighters moving systematically through the terrain toward her position. They were using proper tactical movement techniques, with some fighters providing cover while others advanced. These men knew their business and would not make the same mistakes as the earlier search teams. Sarah checked her ammunition status. She had 8 rounds remaining in her rifle and 2 full magazines for her sidearm. Against the number of enemy forces converging on her position, that ammunition would not last long in sustained combat. She needed a way to break contact before being surrounded and overwhelmed. The terrain around her position offered limited escape routes. Behind her was open ground that provided no concealment from enemy fire. To either side were steep slopes that would be difficult to traverse quickly while under fire. Her only option was to continue moving along the ridge, staying ahead of the search teams while waiting for air support to arrive. As Sarah prepared to move from her current position, she heard something that made her reconsider her options. One of the enemy radios was transmitting coordinates in English, apparently calling for artillery fire on suspected American positions. If the enemy had access to artillery or mortar fire, both her position and Alpha Company's extraction point would be at risk. Sarah transmitted this critical intelligence immediately. Mustang Base. Enemy is calling for indirect fire on friendly positions. Recommend immediate suppression of enemy artillery capabilities. The response was immediate and reassuring. Raven 6. Fast movers are inbound with ordnance, specifically for artillery suppression. Continue evasion and stay clear of enemy positions. Sarah began moving carefully through the rocks toward a new position that would give her better observation of enemy activities while keeping her clear of the approaching airstrikes. As she moved, she could hear the distinctive sound of jet engines approaching at high speed. The first airstrike came without warning, a devastating explosion that shook the entire ridge as precision-guided munitions struck the enemy command vehicle. Sarah felt the shock wave through the rocks beneath her as the blast eliminated the mobile command center and anyone positioned nearby. Additional explosions followed in rapid succession as the jet aircraft engaged multiple targets throughout the enemy position. Sarah could see fighters running for cover as the deadly accurate bombing runs eliminated vehicles, equipment, and personnel with clinical efficiency. But even as the airstrikes disrupted enemy operations, Sarah could see that some enemy forces were still organized and functional. Several search teams had taken cover among the rocks and were continuing their advance toward her position. The foreign advisors had trained these fighters well, and they were not panicking despite the devastating air attacks. Sarah realized she was still in immediate danger from the ground forces, even though air support was eliminating the larger enemy formations. She needed to continue moving to avoid the converging search teams while staying clear of friendly airstrikes that might mistake her for an enemy target. As she moved through the maze of rocks and vegetation, Sarah came across evidence of the enemy's sophisticated preparation for this operation. Hidden supply caches contained not just ammunition and weapons, but advanced communication equipment and detailed maps of the local area. This was not an improvised operation, but a carefully planned military action. Sarah photographed the equipment and maps with her tactical camera, gathering intelligence that would be valuable for understanding enemy capabilities and intentions. The level of preparation indicated that this operation was part of a larger strategic plan rather than a simple ambush of American forces. The sound of helicopter rotors was getting closer, and Sarah could see Apache gunships approaching her area. The pilots were coordinating with ground controllers to identify enemy positions while avoiding friendly fire incidents. Sarah activated her infrared beacon to mark her location for the incoming aircraft. Apache 77. This is Raven 6. Sarah transmitted on the air support frequency. I am marking my position with IR strobe. Enemy search teams are approximately 100 meters south and east of my location. The Apache pilot's response was professional and reassuring. Raven 6, I have your strobe. We are engaging enemy positions south of your location. Keep your head down and be ready to move on my command. The Apache helicopter's 30mm cannon began firing with devastating effect, eliminating enemy positions that had been threatening Sarah's escape routes. The sound of the powerful weapon echoed across the valley as armor-piercing rounds tore through rock formations where enemy fighters had taken cover. Sarah could see the immediate effect of the air support. Enemy fighters who had been advancing toward her position were now running for deeper cover or abandoning their search entirely. The coordinated hunt, for her, was collapsing under the weight of superior firepower. But Sarah knew her mission was not complete until she reached friendly lines safely. The enemy forces had been disrupted and scattered, but individual fighters might still pose a threat during her withdrawal. She needed to move carefully toward the extraction point while remaining alert for remaining enemy contact. As Sarah began her movement towards safety, she could hear radio traffic confirming that Alpha Company's evacuation was complete. All 18 soldiers had been successfully extracted from the valley, including the wounded personnel. The rescue mission that had begun with her desperate helicopter insertion was finally succeeding. But Sarah's own extraction would require navigating several hundred meters of uncertain terrain while enemy forces were still active in the area. The most dangerous part of her mission might still be ahead of her. Sarah moved carefully through the scattered rocks and debris left by the airstrikes, her rifle ready as she navigated toward the designated extraction point. The ridge was eerily quiet now, with only the distant sound of helicopter rotors and the occasional crackle of burning equipment breaking the mountain silence. The devastating air support had effectively ended organized enemy resistance, but Sarah knew that individual fighters might still be hiding among the rocks. Her radio crackled with updates from the extraction coordinator. Raven 6, this is extract control. We have a bird inbound for your pickup. Landing zone is secured and ready for your arrival. Estimated time to your position is 12 minutes. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while scanning the terrain ahead for any signs of enemy activity. The extraction point was approximately 400 meters from her current position, requiring movement across open ground that offered minimal cover. If any enemy fighters had survived the airstrikes, this would be their best opportunity to engage her. As she moved through a section of broken rocks near the crest of the ridge, Sarah heard voices speaking in the local language. The voices were low and urgent, coming from a position perhaps 50 meters to her right. At least 2 enemy fighters had survived the devastating air attacks and were apparently trying to coordinate their next move. Sarah crept closer to investigate, using a shallow depression in the ground to mask her approach. Through gaps in the rocks, she could see 2 fighters crouched behind the wreckage of one of the destroyed vehicles. Both men were wounded with blood visible on their clothing, but they were still armed and appeared to be planning some kind of action. One of the fighters was speaking into a radio, apparently trying to contact other survivors. The second man was checking his rifle and ammunition, preparing for what might be a final engagement. Sarah realized these were not ordinary fighters, but part of the foreign advisory team she had observed earlier. Their equipment and tactical discipline marked them as professional soldiers. Sarah faced a tactical decision. She could bypass these fighters and continue toward the extraction point, avoiding unnecessary contact. Or she could eliminate them to prevent any potential threat to the extraction operation or future friendly forces in the area. Given their professional capabilities and access to communications, leaving them alive might create problems later. The decision was made for her when one of the fighters spotted movement in her direction and pointed toward her approximate position. Both men began moving through the rocks with weapons ready, clearly intending to intercept her before she could reach the extraction point. Sarah selected a firing position behind a large boulder that provided both protection and a clear field of fire toward the approaching threats. At a range of 30 meters, with stationary targets, this should be a routine engagement despite her limited remaining ammunition. The first fighter appeared between 2 rocks, moving cautiously but steadily in her direction. Sarah's shot took him center mass, and he dropped without firing. The second fighter immediately took cover, but his position was partially exposed to Sarah's angle of attack. Sarah waited patiently as the surviving fighter tried to find a better position. When he moved from behind his cover, apparently trying to flank her position, Sarah was ready with a carefully aimed shot that ended the threat permanently. With the immediate danger eliminated, Sarah continued her movement toward the extraction point. The radio traffic indicated that helicopter was approaching on schedule, and ground security teams were already in position around the landing zone. Her longest day in combat was finally approaching its conclusion. As Sarah reached the final approach to the extraction point, she could see the landing zone clearly marked with colored smoke grenades. Apache helicopters were providing security overhead, while a Black Hawk helicopter prepared for landing. Ground personnel were visible in defensive positions around the perimeter, ensuring security for the extraction operation. Sarah activated her identification beacon and moved toward the landing zone, keeping her weapon ready, but pointed downward to avoid being mistaken for an enemy fighter. The security team had been briefed on her approach, but combat situations could be unpredictable and dangerous even during friendly operations. Extract control. This is Raven 6 approaching the landing zone from the northeast. I have friendly personnel in sight and am moving to the pickup point. The response came immediately. Raven 6, we have you in sight. Move directly to the aircraft when it touches down. Security teams are covering your approach. The Black Hawk helicopter flared for landing, its rotors creating a whirlwind of dust and debris around the landing zone. Sarah could see the crew chief gesturing for her to approach the aircraft as soon as the wheels touched the ground. Sarah ran toward the helicopter, her combat gear bouncing with each step. Behind her, the mountain ridge was scarred with smoke and craters from the airstrikes that had ended the enemy threat. Ahead of her was safety, medical attention, and the opportunity to provide detailed intelligence reports about what she had discovered during her mission. As she reached the helicopter and climbed aboard, Sarah felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and relief that followed successful combat operations. The crew chief helped her secure her equipment, while the aircraft lifted off immediately, not wanting to remain in the area any longer than necessary. Through the aircraft windows, Sarah could see the valley where Alpha Company had been trapped just hours earlier. The landscape looked peaceful now, with no visible signs of the intense combat that had occurred. The enemy positions had been eliminated so thoroughly by airstrikes that little evidence remained of the sophisticated operation they had mounted. "Ma'am, are you injured?" the crew chief asked, conducting a quick visual assessment of Sarah's condition. Sarah inventoried her physical status. She had minor cuts from rock fragments and was exhausted from hours of high-intensity combat, but she was not seriously wounded. More importantly, she was carrying intelligence information that would be valuable for understanding enemy capabilities in the region. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, "but I have critical intelligence about foreign military involvement in enemy operations. Someone needs to debrief me as soon as possible." The crew chief nodded and relayed this information to the flight crew and ground controllers. Intelligence personnel would be waiting when they reached FOB Mustang, ready to conduct detailed debriefings about what Sarah had observed during her mission behind enemy lines. As the helicopter flew towards safety, Sarah reflected on the events of the day. What had begun as a desperate rescue mission had evolved into a significant intelligence coup. The discovery of foreign military advisors and sophisticated equipment would require major revisions to threat assessments for the region. More importantly, 18 American soldiers were alive because of decisions made in desperate circumstances. Alpha Company had been extracted successfully, with all personnel accounted for. The wounded soldiers were receiving medical treatment, and the unit would be operational again after rest and resupply. Sarah also thought about the enemy fighters she had engaged during the mission. Professional soldiers doing their job in difficult circumstances, just as she had been doing hers. Combat was never personal, even when it was deadly. Both sides had fought with skill and courage, but superior firepower and air support had ultimately determined the outcome. The helicopter was approaching FOB Mustang when Sarah received an unexpected radio transmission. "Raven 6, this is Mustang 6 Actual. Outstanding work today. Alpha Company sends their thanks, and higher headquarters wants a detailed briefing as soon as you're ready." Mustang 6 Actual was the base commander, a full colonel who normally dealt with much larger operations than individual soldier rescues. His personal involvement indicated that Sarah's mission had attracted attention at higher levels of command. "Thank you, sir. I'll be ready for briefing as soon as I've cleaned up and organized my notes." As the helicopter touched down at FOB Mustang, Sarah could see medical personnel waiting near the landing pad along with intelligence officers carrying briefing materials. News of her successful mission had apparently spread throughout the base, and multiple departments wanted to understand what had happened during her hours behind enemy lines. Sarah gathered her equipment and prepared to leave the aircraft. The immediate danger was over, but the intelligence work was just beginning. Her observations about foreign military involvement would require detailed analysis and careful reporting to higher headquarters. Lieutenant Rodriguez was among the personnel waiting at the landing pad, his face showing relief and admiration. "Captain Shun, glad to see you made it back safely. Alpha Company is asking when they can buy you dinner." Sarah smiled as she stepped off the helicopter. "Tell them I'll take a rain check. Right now I need to get this intelligence information to the people who can use it." As she walked toward the base operations center, Sarah realized that jumping from a helicopter into an enemy ambush had been only the beginning of a much larger story. The intelligence she had gathered would influence military operations throughout the region, and the successful rescue of Alpha Company would be remembered as an example of what individual courage could accomplish in desperate circumstances. But for Sarah Chun, it had simply been another day at work, doing what professional soldiers do when good people need help and conventional solutions aren't available. She had seen a problem, developed a solution, and executed it with the skills and courage that defined her military career. The mission was complete, the soldiers were safe, and valuable intelligence had been gathered. In Sarah's opinion, that made it a very good day indeed, despite the fact that it had begun with jumping from a helicopter into what most people would consider certain death. As she entered the operations center for her intelligence debriefing, Sarah was already thinking about the next mission, the next challenge, and the next opportunity to make a difference in the lives of the soldiers who depended on leaders willing to take calculated risks when the stakes were high. The legend of Captain Sarah Chun had grown significantly during her hours behind enemy lines, but Sarah herself was focused on the future rather than the past. There would always be more missions, more challenges, and more opportunities to demonstrate that sometimes the impossible is just another word for difficult. 6 months later, Sarah would be promoted to Major and assigned to lead a special operations unit tasked with conducting similar high-risk missions throughout the region. The intelligence she had gathered during the helicopter insertion mission would prove invaluable for future operations, and her tactical innovations would be studied at military schools for years to come. But those were stories for another day. For now, Captain Sarah Chun had 18 living soldiers as proof that sometimes jumping from a helicopter into an enemy ambush is exactly the right thing to do, even when everyone else thinks you're crazy. The battle was over, the mission was complete, and Sarah Chun had once again proven that courage, skill, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. It was exactly the kind of day that made a military career worthwhile, despite the risks and challenges that came with the profession of arms.